people believed this case was solved. In fact, police were confident they had the answer. 2 deaths. Same house. Same explanation. Bad luck. In 2000, a man named Michael Wallace, only 38 years old, was found dead in his home in New York. He was healthy. No history of heart problems. No signs of violence. Doctors ruled it a heart attack. The case was closed. 6 years later it happened again. Michael's widow, Stacy Castor, had remarried. Her second husband, David Castor, was found collapsed inside the same house. This time police found something different. On the kitchen table, an empty antifreeze container, a glass of alcohol, a typed note. The note said David had poisoned himself and confessed to killing Stacy's first husband years earlier. To investigators it looked simple. David had killed Michael. Then guilt finally caught up with him. The mystery was solved. Everyone moved on, except one detective, because something didn't sit right. Antifreeze doesn't work the way the note described, and people don't usually drink it calmly without reacting. So they took another look. The autopsy changed everything. David hadn't just ingested antifreeze. He had been drugged first. Sedatives. Enough to knock someone unconscious. Which meant he couldn't have poisoned himself. That's when police reopened Michael Wallace's death. They exhumed his body. The results were identical. Antifreeze. Same poison. Same pattern. 2 husbands. 1 cause. And suddenly, the person everyone trusted became the focus. Stacy Castor. The grieving wife. The cooperative witness. The only constant in both deaths. Investigators searched her computer. The confession note. Type there. The sedatives. Prescribed to her. The timeline. Only worked if someone else administered the poison. The case collapsed. But Stacy wasn't finished. When she realized police were closing in, she tried one last move. She poisoned her own daughter, then staged it as a suicide attempt, hoping to shift suspicion away from herself. Her daughter survived and told police everything. At trial, prosecutors laid it out clearly. 2 husbands, 1 poison, 1 person who benefited every time. The jury didn't take long. Stacy Castor was found guilty and sentenced to 51 years to life in prison. Years later, she died behind bars. No poison, no note, no explanation left to hide behind. They thought the case was solved. But the truth didn't come from new technology. It came from simply asking one question. Who was there every time? Police thought this case was over the moment the confession was signed. No mystery. No unanswered questions. Just a son who admitted he killed his mother. In 1987, Pamela Powers was found dead inside her home in Michigan. She had been stabbed repeatedly. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing stolen. No unknown suspects. Investigators didn't look far. They looked at her son. David Powers was 18 years old. Quiet. Emotionally fragile. Still living at home. Police brought him in for questioning. What followed lasted hours. No lawyer. No parent present. No breaks. First, David denied everything. Then the pressure increased. Detectives told him. The evidence proved he did it. Confessing was the only way to help himself. His memory was blocking the truth. They fed him details. Where the knife was. How many times she was stabbed. Where she fell. Eventually, exhausted and confused, David said what they wanted. He confessed. The case was closed. In court, the confession was everything. No physical evidence tied David to the murder. No fingerprints. No blood evidence. No witnesses. But it didn't matter. Jurors heard the confession. And that was enough. David Powers was convicted of murdering his own mother. He was sent to prison. Years passed. David never changed his story. He said the confession was false. That he repeated what police told him. That he didn't remember anything because nothing had happened. First, no one listened. Confessions don't lie. Except sometimes. They do. Decades later, the case was re-examined. And this is where everything fell apart. Experts reviewed the interrogation tapes. They found leading questions, coercive tactics, false details fed directly to David. Details that later appeared in his confession. Then came the biggest problem. The murder timeline didn't match. The crime scene didn't match. And most importantly, the physical evidence didn't match David at all. In fact, it pointed away from him. New witnesses came forward. Alternative suspects were identified. People police never seriously investigated. The confession, the foundation of the case, collapsed. Without it, there was almost nothing left. After spending more than 25 years in prison, David Power's conviction was overturned. He walked free. Not because police solved the case wrong, but because they stopped investigating once they got the answer they wanted. Pamela Power's murder remains officially unsolved. The real killer was never caught. And the truth came too late to give David back his life. They thought the confession ended the mystery. Instead, it created the biggest lie of all. For years, this case was treated as a success story. A woman was murdered. A husband was convicted. Justice, everyone believed, was served. And then the science collapsed. In the early 1990s, Dorothy Donovan was found dead in her home. There were no witnesses. No signs of forced entry. No clear murder weapon. Police focused on one person immediately. Her husband. Investigators said the marriage was unstable. They said arguments were frequent. They said motive was obvious. But motive alone wasn't enough. So they leaned on something juries trusted without question at the time. Forensic science. At trial, experts testified about bloodstains. They told the jury the pattern proved a violent struggle. They said the blood placement could only mean one thing. Dorothy had been attacked. And her husband had been there. The jury believed them. The case was closed. Years later, everything unraveled. Independent forensic experts reviewed the evidence. And they reached a very different conclusion. The bloodstain analysis was flawed. The methods used were outdated. The conclusions were overstated. Some claims had no scientific basis at all. Patterns that were presented as facts were actually opinions. Worse, some testing techniques used at trial were later discredited entirely. The evidence jurors trusted most was no longer considered reliable science. Without it, the case had almost nothing left. Appeals followed. Courts were forced to admit something uncomfortable. The conviction rested on evidence that would likely never be allowed today. The certainty that closed the case was built on guesswork. Eventually, the conviction was overturned. Not because new evidence proved innocence, but because the evidence used to convict could no longer stand. Dorothy Donovan's murder is still unresolved. The person responsible was never identified. And the man who spent years in prison paid the price for science that hadn't caught up with itself yet. They thought the case was solved. But when the science was questioned, everything fell apart. Police never officially said this case was unsolved. They didn't need to. They believed they already knew who did it. And for years that belief stopped everything else. In 1987, the Dardeen family was found brutally murdered in their home in rural Illinois. Keith Dardeen, his wife Elaine, and their young son were all dead. Elaine was pregnant at the time. The crime scene was beyond disturbing. And from the beginning, investigators settled on a story. They believed the killer was someone passing through. Drifter. A violent stranger. Someone who came and went without a trace. The theory made sense. There were no known enemies. No clear motive. No obvious suspect close to the family. So police focused outward. Then a man was arrested in a different case. He was violent. He was unstable. And he had been in the area around the time of the murders. To investigators, this was the answer they needed. They quietly tied him to the Dardeen murders. No trial. No public announcement. But internally, the case was treated as essentially solved. And that's where the problem began. Because once police believed they had their man, they stopped looking. Years later, independent investigators reviewed the case. They found serious issues. The suspect police focused on had no solid physical evidence connecting him to the crime scene. No DNA. No fingerprints. No eyewitnesses. Even his timeline didn't fully match. Worse, key leads were never followed. Reports of suspicious vehicles were ignored. Possible connections to other crimes were dismissed. Alternate suspects were never seriously investigated. All because investigators believed the case already had an answer. The truth was uncomfortable. The Dardine family murders were never actually solved. They were assumed to be solved. An assumption replaced investigation. To this day, no one has been charged. No one has stood trial. The family never got justice. Police believed they had closed the case. But believing isn't the same as proving. And when the evidence was re-examined, everything fell apart. Police were certain they had the killer. The evidence was clear. The suspect confessed. The case was closed. Or so they thought. In 1981, Carol Lubon, a young woman in California, was found murdered in her home. She had been strangled. There were no signs of forced entry. No clear motive. No witnesses. The investigation was intense but frustrating. Soon, suspicion fell on someone close to her. Someone police thought had the opportunity, motive, and access. The man was arrested. He confessed. The case was solved, or that's what everyone believed. But years later, questions started to surface. DNA technology had advanced. Evidence that was considered reliable at the time could now be tested properly. The crime scene was re-examined. And that's when everything fell apart. The DNA didn't match the man in prison. Not at all. The physical evidence contradicted his confession. Even the timeline he claimed didn't fit the facts. It became clear. The investigation had been rushed. The wrong person had been blamed. And the real killer, still unknown. Carol Lubon's murder remains officially unsolved today. The person responsible has never faced justice. And the case that once seemed clear collapsed completely under scrutiny. They thought the case was solved. But when the evidence was tested again, the truth proved something terrifying. Sometimes the answers you trust most are the ones that are wrong. At first glance, this looked like a straightforward case. A murder during a politically tense time. The suspect was caught. The investigation ended. Everyone thought it was over. In the late 1980s, Craig Williamson, an intelligence officer in South Africa, was connected to multiple violent incidents. One of them involved the murder of an activist during apartheid. The authorities claimed the case was solved. They had a suspect. They had a story. The files were closed. But decades later, historians and investigative journalists dug deeper. They discovered that the solution had been carefully manufactured. The investigation had been manipulated. Evidence had been altered. The truth was buried. The person initially accused had been set up. Documents later revealed a network of state-sponsored deception, cover-ups, and false leads. Witnesses were coerced. Statements were falsified. The real events were almost unrecognizable. Suddenly, the case everyone thought was solved turned into a web of lies. Nothing was as it seemed. The investigation had only confirmed what the authorities wanted people to believe. The real killer and the full story behind the murder remained hidden. To this day, the truth about the case only exists in fragments. The murder appears solved on paper. But when you look closer, everything falls apart. They thought they knew the answer. But the deeper you dig, the clearer it becomes. The system lied, and the real truth never surfaced. Two women. Name. One terrifying mystery. The Mary Morris murders. In October of the year 2000, Houston, Texas was a city of millions. A place where strangers passed each other every day without a second thought. In a city that large, coincidences were easy to dismiss. Until one appeared that was impossible to ignore. On October 12th, a woman named Mary Morris failed to show up for work. When her family couldn't reach her, they contacted the police. Later that day, her car was found abandoned on the side of a road. It didn't look damaged. There were no signs of a struggle. But miles away, in a wooded area, police made a disturbing discovery. Mary Morris was dead. She had been beaten and her body partially burned. There were no witnesses and no clear suspects. Investigators were left with more questions than answers. At first, it appeared to be a tragic but isolated crime. Then, just 4 days later, it happened again. Another woman failed to come home. Her car was also found abandoned. And when police searched nearby wooded areas, they made another grim discovery. Her name was Mary Morris. Different woman, different life, same city, name. And the manner of death was hauntingly similar. Both women had been beaten. Both bodies were found in secluded wooded areas. Both cars were abandoned in ways that suggested planning rather than panic. The odds of two women with the same name being murdered in the same city within days of each other were staggering. Houston police were forced to confront an unsettling question. Was this coincidence or was something else at work? Investigators quickly stated that the cases were unrelated. The two women lived different lives. They were different ages. They worked different jobs. They moved in different social circles. According to police, there was no direct evidence linking the murders. But the similarities were difficult to dismiss. As details emerged, the mystery deepened. One of the Mary Morrises had been involved in a contentious divorce. There were rumors, never fully confirmed, that her former husband had ties to organized crime. The other Mary Morris, however, appeared to have no known enemies at all. That raised a chilling possibility. What if only one woman was the intended target? And what if the other was killed simply because she shared the same name? The theory was never proven. No arrests were made. No suspect was publicly identified. Over time, the case faded from headlines, even as the questions remained. More than 20 years later, both murders remain unsolved. Two women lived separate lives, unaware that they shared a name with someone they would never meet. Within days, both were dead. And the truth behind why they were killed may never be fully known. In a city of millions, coincidence should be easy to accept. But some coincidences feel too precise to ignore. And sometimes, the most frightening part of a mystery isn't what we know. It's what was never explained. The 50 twisted lessons hidden inside the questions the cases left behind. 1. Question: can a case be officially solved and still be completely false? Yes. Solved often means investigation stopped, not truth found. 2. Question: what's the moment most cases actually fail? The moment police decide they already know the answer. 3. Question: why do investigators fall in love with their first theory? Because changing it feels like admitting weakness. 4. Question: is a confession proof of guilt? No. It's proof of pressure. 5. Question: why do innocent people confess to crimes they didn't commit? A. Because exhaustion, fear, and authority can overwrite memory. 6. Question: what's more dangerous than a criminal with a weapon? A system that refuses to doubt itself. 7. Question: why do juries believe bad forensic science? Because confidence sounds like certainty. 8. Question: can forensic experts be wrong and still sound convincing? A. Yes, especially when the science hasn't caught up yet. 9. Question: why does outdated science ruin lives? Because it locks guesses into permanent verdicts. 10. Question: how many wrongful convictions exist because science evolved too late? A. Enough to prove justice isn't timeless. 11. Question: why is the most cooperative person often the least suspected? Because trust disarms scrutiny. 12. Question: how can one person commit multiple murders without suspicion? By being the only constant no one questions. 13. Question: why do investigators ignore patterns until it's too late? Because patterns threaten conclusions already written. 14. Question: what kills more investigations? Lack of evidence or false certainty? False certainty. 15. Question: why are alternative suspects rarely explored? Because they complicate the story. 16. Question: can motive exist without guilt? Yes, but motive is easier to sell than doubt. 17. Question: why does common sense fail in criminal investigations? Because crime rarely follows logic, but interrogations do. 18. Question: what happens when police build evidence around a suspect instead of suspects around evidence? Innocent people go to prison. Guilty people disappear. 19. Question: why do wrongful convictions take decades to undo? Because correcting mistakes threatens reputations. 20. Question: is justice about truth or finality? Too often it's about ending discomfort. 21. Question: why do courts resist reopening old cases? Because every reopened case questions every closed one. 22. Question: what's the most dangerous sentence in law enforcement? A. We already solved this. 23. Question: how many unsolved murders are actually missolved? More than officially acknowledged. 24. Question: why do families accept false closure? Because endless uncertainty hurts more. 25. Question: can one wrong verdict create more victims than the crime itself? Yes, it multiplies harm silently. 26. Question: why do systems protect outcomes instead of truth? Because outcomes can be defended. Truth cannot be controlled. 27. Question: how often does police belief replace proof? Often enough to be dangerous. 28. Question: why do solved cases quietly collapse years later? Because technology doesn't respect old conclusions. 29. Question: can DNA expose lies even decades later? Yes, and that terrifies systems built on finality. 30. Question: why are coerced confessions still trusted in 2026? Because admitting their failure would expose thousands of cases. 31. Question: what's the psychological trap investigators fall into? Confirmation bias disguised as experience. 32. Question: why do innocent people struggle to prove innocence? A. Because innocence leaves fewer traces than guilt. 33. Question: can coincidence hide a targeted crime? A. Yes, especially when names, timing, or patterns overlap. 34. Question: why do serial crimes sometimes look isolated? Because they're investigated in isolation. 35. Question: what's more believable to juries? Facts or stories? Stories. 36. Question: why does narrative matter more than accuracy? Because humans remember meaning, not data. 37. Question: can silence be institutional? A. Yes, and it's often policy without being written. 38. Question: why do false suspects stay locked in public memory? Because first impressions are rarely corrected. 39. Question: what happens when investigations stop at good enough? Truth becomes collateral damage. 40. Question: why are real killers rarely caught after wrongful convictions? A. Because once a case is closed, the trail goes cold. 41. Question: can the wrong story feel more satisfying than the truth? A. Yes, especially when the truth has no ending. 42. Question: why does authority make lies believable? Because trust is borrowed power. 43. Question: how many convictions rely on evidence that wouldn't survive today? A. Enough to overwhelm the system if reopened. 44. Question: why do appeals feel like battles instead of corrections? Because the system treats error as an enemy. 45. Question: can justice be delayed and still be justice? Only for records, not for lives. 46. Question what's the real cost of a wrong conviction? A time, truth, and the real victim's voice. 47. Question why are solved cases the most dangerous ones to trust? Because no one is looking anymore. 48. Question what question terrifies every bad investigation? A. What if we're wrong? 49. Question why does reopening cases feel like betrayal to institutions? Because it admits justice is fragile. 50. Question what single question exposes every false conclusion? A. Who benefits if this story never changes?